I am Kashif Salik, Associate Research Fellow at Sustainable Development Policy Institute. On behalf of SDPI, I warmly welcome you all in the seminar on environmental social governance practices in Pakistan, progress, challenges, and way forward. This seminar is being jointly organized by Sustainable Development Policy Institute and Nestle Pakistan. Ladies and gentlemen, as you are aware that environmental degradation and climate change are the daunting challenges of our time. Environmental issues such as air, water, soil, pollution, waste disposal, deforestation are causing many public and health and well-being issues. For example, the smog in winter and air quality standards, which we observe, are very high, and this has impacted our not only the daily life but also the economic activities, and above all, this climate change, as we know, has raised frequent and extreme floods, which we are observing right now in the country, along with the extreme droughts in the south and heat waves impacting lives and livelihoods of the millions. So to reduce and tackle these challenges, environmental issues, multiple approaches are now being employed globally. ESG is one of such approach. The environmental, social, and governance ESG approach provides a unique way that ensures sustainable environmental sustainability, safeguards social equality, diversity, and better product management for employees and consumers. To initiate this discussion on ESG in Pakistan, SDPI and Nestle Pakistan has organized this seminar, and this seminar has two overarching objectives and questions. That is, what are the ways in which the private sector moves swiftly toward greener and low carbon economy in Pakistan, and how we can improve social inclusion, take better decisions with better supportive policies, and make best laid plans for safer investments and smooth business operations in the country. The format of the seminar will be a panel discussion moderated by an expert. Now I'd like to introduce the panelists. First of all, I'd like to introduce our online panelist, Ms. Seema Kamil, Deputy Director, State Bank of Pakistan. Ms. Kamil became our first woman appointed as the Deputy Governor of the State Bank of Pakistan. She has over 25 years of experience in diverse fields of commercial banking, SMEs, rural consumers, and corporate financing and investment banking. Ms. Kamil holds degree in business from Kingston University, UK, and MBA from City University, London, as well as hold an honorary doctorate degree from Kingston University. Before joining the bank, Ms. Kamil was the first ever woman appointed as the president of a private sector commercial bank, which is United Bank Limited. Thank you, Ms. Kamil, for joining the seminar.
Assalamualaikum, and thank you for having me.
Welcome. Now I'd like to introduce Mr. Waqar Ahmed of Corporate Affairs and Sustainability of Nestle Pakistan and Afghanistan. Mr. Waqar, with a degree on economic policy management from Columbia University, is responsible for leading the institutional networking and stakeholder engagement for public policy and business advocacy activities in Nestle. He is also leading the sustainability agenda of SDGs by engaging the communities and value chain partners. He also worked with World Bank, IMF, and as CEO, SAARC Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and many other assignments with International Chamber of Commerce. Thank you, Mr. Waqar Ahmed, for joining the seminar. Next, our online panelist is Dr. Abid Qayyum Sillari, Executive Director, Sustainable Development Policy Institute. SDPI is a Pakistan premier policy research think tank since 2007. Dr. Sulary is the member of different policy-making forums and advisory boards, including advisory board of CARIC region countries, think tank networks, co-chair of board of climate action network for South Asia, and lead expert for World Economic Forum's transformation mapping initiative for Pakistan. He's also served as a member of the Prime Minister Economic Advisory Council. He holds PhD degree from University of Greenwich, UK. Thank you, Dr. Sulary, for joining the seminar. Now I'd like to invite this panel to come and join me at the podium. First, I request Ms. Sadia Khan, Commissioner, Securities and Exchange Commissioner of Pakistan, to join the podium. Ms. Sadia is the first female to hold this position. She has also served as the President and CEO of Pakistan Institute of Corporate Governance. Ms. Sadia Khan holds master's degree in economics jointly from Cambridge and Yale universities and MBA from INSEAD, France. She has diverse experience in investment banking, financial regulation, businesses and entrepreneurship, strategic business management. She has also worked with ADB, the State Bank of Pakistan, and served as the Honorary Consul General of Finland in Karachi. She has authored a book titled Corporate Governance Landscape of Pakistan, published by Oxford University Press. Thank you, Ms. Sadia. Now I'd like to request Mr. Ahmed Alam to join the podium. Mr. Alam is an environmental lawyer specializing in the energy, water, natural resources, and urban infrastructure sector. He served as a member of Pakistan Climate Change Council and Punjab Environmental Protection Council, and a chairman of Lahore Electric Supply Company and Lahore Waste Management Company. He currently serves as a senior advisor to Air Quality Asia and member of Hisar Foundation think tank on the rational use of water. Thank you, Mr. Alam, for joining us. Next, I'd like to request Mr. Zishan Sohail to join the podium. Zishan Sohail leads the public affairs portfolio for Nestle in the North region. He began his career in the development sector with the UN and World Bank systems, followed by a nearly a decade experience in corporate sector focused on food and beverage industry. He has a degree in international businesses and international relations, as well as an MBA. Thank you, Zishan, for joining us. Now I may request Fahim Sardar, moderator for this session, to join the podium. Mr. Fahim Sardar is currently a senior policy specialist at the Strategic Policy Planning Cell of the National Security Division of the Government of Pakistan. Mr. Sardar has over 21 years of experience in the financial industry in relation to government policy and capital markets. He has experience in investments, stock market, finance, policy governance, strategic management, and much more. Prior to the current assignments with the government, he has the managing director of Tension, an independent economic think tank and corporate advisory, and also CEO of ASPI Securities and Lahore Stock Exchange. He authored 3 books titled The New Finance Construct, Mind Conquest, and CEO at 34. These books are now part of curricula in various universities. Thank you, Mr. Sardar. Before I hand over the seminar proceedings to Mr. Fahim Sardar, I'd like to request Dr. Abed Sulary for his welcome remarks.
Thank you, Kashif. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending from where you have joined this meeting today. First of all, on behalf of organizers, my apologies for starting late. As you know, those who are in Islamabad, they know that today the road situation is particularly difficult to commute, and many people they couldn't join in time, and that's why the delay was to give them more time to be able to join us. But I'll begin by thanking those who could join, especially those who could join in person, as well as Ms. Simi Kamal, who has spared her time from her busy schedule to be online with us today. The purpose of this discussion today was to generate some sort of brainstorming around ESG, Environmental, Social, and Governance Index ESG framework, how and to what extent such framework can meet the expectation of stakeholders when it comes to clean and green investment, when it comes to social responsibility, and when it comes to corporate governance, improved corporate governance. And I know the esteemed panelists like Ms. Sarah Khan and Rafi Alam they would be able to shed more light on it. But ESG to me is a way forward and is a win-win situation in circumstances where we have been accusing private sector for all the wrongdoing, especially in the environment. So I remember as part of, as a young environmental activist, we used to think that multinationals, they are the root cause of all environmental problem. And then gradually we realized that without involving those multinational as part of solution and just considering them as part of problem, perhaps will not take us anywhere. And now the thinking for last 10-15 years is that all stakeholders, including corporates, including businesses, including private sector, they need to play their role. In the Western world, individual investors, while they decide to invest, they decide to invest in clean and green corporations with the low carbon emission footprints. And in countries like Pakistan, the likes of Nestle and many other multinational companies, they are actually being a pioneer in promoting this initiative. And of course, one would like to see that this initiative doesn't stop only at multinationals, but also many of the national companies and national businesses, they also join it. Whether we have conducive environment to promote such initiative in Pakistan, what sort of governance framework is here in Pakistan, what are the incentives available for corporations and companies to adopt it, and how the multinationals working in Pakistan, they can take some leverage in their international businesses by adopting ESG framework in Pakistan. These are some of the questions that come to mind. Those who got a chance to read Economist article of last week, there was this brilliant article on ESG. If you look at the Economist title, they have actually with a scissor, they had this word ESG, and with a scissor they had trimmed the word E. And the crux of the article was that it's about mission, it's about environment, and perhaps social and governance, merging social and governance indicators with environment. That is not of any use because it may be contradictory. And they had given this example of Tesla and Elon Musk and his corporate governance model. So this is something which is discussed both positively as well as negatively. For countries like Pakistan, we have to actually customize it, and we have to come up with our own version of indexing, with our own version of marking, and try to actually facilitate such initiatives. I'm sorry that Senator Shari Rahman couldn't join us today, as she had to go to Balochistan for flood relief activities, overviewing flood relief activities. But on behalf of STPI and on behalf of our position in different public sector forums where we can link businesses and public policy makers. We assure you that the recommendations from today's talk, those would be compiled and those would be conveyed to the right set of stakeholders, both legislators as well as the senior policy makers, so that this ESG framework in Pakistan, it can be improved, it can be promoted, and the challenge around implementing it can be smoothened. I'm sorry, I'm not in Pakistan, so couldn't join in person, but I'll remain logged in and I'll get benefit of the learned discussion from the panelists. Thank you, Waqar Saab, for collaborating with the STPI, and STPI looks forward to many more such collaborations in future too. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Swery, for welcome remarks. Now I request Fahim Sardar to please start the seminar proceedings. Please.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Fahim. I'll be with you for this discussion for this afternoon. When you talk about corporate governance, a lot comes to mind. In my experience, my relationship with corporate governance started sometime in 2013. Corporate governance has always been a buzzword, and to be honest, it is a methodology through which you can better govern your organization for longer times, for more generations, and usually we have this, we understand from business, studying business history, that it's the third generation that typically, where the business ends. Sometimes it ends in the same generation. That's a side issue because we are now talking about ESG. So without further ado, I'd like to start. And firstly, I have to thank STPI and Nestle for having me here. I'll try to help the proceedings in my own way. I would request all esteemed panelists to, we're going to give everyone, there are going to be 2 rounds. So in round 1, we will be giving everyone approximately 5 minutes to answer a few questions. Please feel free to delve into what you think is appropriate with what is important. We will be maintaining the time factor so that everybody gets a chance to contribute. And when we get into the second round is going to be a little different because that's going to be a little more, I wouldn't use the word flamboyant, but it's going to be based on round 1. So that's not scripted at all. We're going to see where the conversation takes us. And we'll try to have a short second round, and after that we can converse the thoughts. So I think let's start. So I would like to request Ms. Seema Kamil, the Deputy Governor of State Bank, to sort of help us understand. I mean, before I ask you the question, just a couple of thoughts from my side, that the State Bank of Pakistan obviously is a very important regulator in Pakistan when it comes to the country as well as to the financial markets. But here we're going to be we're going to be taking a slightly different approach. So, Ms. Kamil, if I can ask you, how important is ESG for the State Bank of Pakistan?
Right. Assalamu alaikum. Can everyone hear me? Is that okay?
Yes.
Yes. So thank you, Fahim Saab, and good afternoon to all the panelists. So in the context of State Bank of Pakistan, if I can just take one step back, and everyone knows about the State Bank of Pakistan and have varying views of what its role is. So I'll just give you the 3 principal roles, which is, or rather 4 really, if you think about it. The first and foremost is price stability. And of course, the controlling or not controlling, but monitoring the foreign exchange markets, which of course you've been hearing a lot about lately. The second is the financial sector soundness, which is to ensure that all the entities that we regulate, and it's not just commercial banks, also microfinance banks, as well as now increasingly the fintech sphere, electronic money institutions and payment system providers and so on. And that soundness, because that looks after public money, is a paramount aim. And the third function is the payment systems in the country, right? So that's part of it is cash, and part of it is, of course, all the new payment systems that we have. And fourthly, once these three are met, is to assist the government in the achievement of the economic policies, keeping the first three paramount. So if the first three are met, then whatever we can do to meet the government's economic policies or to foster them, that's part of our role. So those are the four sort of principal names. With that, ESG becomes a major concern. For one thing, if the main issue with financial stability in the financial sector is to ensure, since they are using both, they leverage it and they use government public funds, the deposits that everyone has in the financial institutions, that has to be used responsibly and therefore lent responsibly. And now increasingly we see that ESG risk, particularly both governance and environmental, is an extremely important part of how banks should make a lending decision. So for us to make sure that the banks are stable, it's very important for us that they can measure and mitigate environmental risk, for example. For example, if you look at climate change, and I think enough will be said today, but we do know that Pakistan is amongst the worst hit 10 countries from climate change perspective. And that affects, for example, our agriculture. Banks do a lot of lending, either directly to farmers or to entities that are linked to the value chain. For example, textile is a major one. And so they need to be able to measure the impact of climate change, and then they need to mitigate it. For it's very easy to say, okay, this is very high risk. There's a lot of climate change, there's a lot of floods, and therefore we can just stop lending to agriculture. Of course, that doesn't work, but they need to be able to measure that. So for financial stability, which is a principal goal of the State Bank, they have to have means to measure ESG risk. For exporters, child labor, the status of women, and so on. So for us, for financial stability, as well as then financial inclusion, that's very important for us, for sustainability. So then you bring in things like the gender gap. So for the State Bank, it is very important and increasingly so. And then maybe in the second round, or now if you have time, I can talk about some of the measures we've done actually as policy responses to ESG issues.
I really like to hear about the measures. And in fact, I was reading your green, there's a green financing policy, which is, I think, it's very interesting. If I can ask you, what are the gaps that you have been able to sort of, what are the three big gaps that you have?
Okay. So, we issued our green banking guidelines back in 2017. Okay. And that tried to give banks a measure of what they ought to be doing on environmental risk management and on green business facilitation, and how they can lend more to green types of businesses and projects. And then, of course, their own impact reduction as well. So those are the kind of guidelines. But if I'm honest about it, there are two aspects. In one sense, we succeeded in the sense that most of the banks and the development finance institutions have green banking policies, and they have integrated environmental risk in their credit risk assessment. However, the issue and the biggest gap, I think, is letter and spirit.
Letter and spirit, we'll get to that, but thank you for pointing that out. And now we go to Ms. Sadia. Well, firstly, it's a pleasure to talk to you because I'm ex-SECP, so I'm biased in favor. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm going to be a little unfair with you because there's another question which I'm springing upon you. because you've been the CEO of PICG. Can I ask you that? What is the for everyone's information? What is the transition of corporate governance to ESG?
Thank you, Fahim. That's a very interesting question and very pertinent because we find a lot of people using these terms interchangeably. That's very important to understand what we're talking about when we mention corporate governance, what we mean when we talk about CSR, and what we mean about ESG. In order to understand that, I think I'd like to go very quickly into the evolutionary journey of corporate governance and then going on to ESG. So corporate governance concepts are as old as the first German stock company is late 18th century. How the importance of corporate governance really came to light after the capital reform in 1980, etc., as people started focusing on the main principles of corporate governance, which is accountability, transparency, and fairness. Now, and a number of crises along the way helped people to focus further on these issues because they realized that the lack of corporate governance was contributing to the widespread crisis in confidence, which were aggravating these crises. So when we talk about corporate governance in the initial phases in the 1980s, 1990s, a lot of focus was really looking at corporate governance from the shareholder perspective, making sure that minority shareholders' interests were protected as well. The conversation slowly progressed to all stakeholders. When we talk about all stakeholders, we talk about the employees, we talk about the creditors, we talk about government agencies, the communities in which these corporates live in. So the conversation slowly evolved for corporate governance vis-a-vis all stakeholders, and hence the triple bottom line, how is a corporate looking after the interests of all its stakeholders. Now, corporate governance, the way it's evolved in ESG is the way CFG is a corporate governance, we'll be working along all the way. The S is elements of corporate social responsibility. We've been talking about, but not too many standards have been yet issued to make sure that there is some focused approach regarding CSR and environment, of course, which is very pertinent, as Seema also mentioned, to what we're facing, to what is being faced globally, to make
Adnan Kashif, are we online?
There's a power issue, I think.
Which I think we can continue with this.
so, and even if you see the first vote in 2002, successive iterations, 2012, 17, 19, you see that there was a sea change in the mindset in terms of the acceptability. And the acceptability was largely driven by the business case for corporate governance, because international investors were pegging their hopes on these corporates which had better corporate governance records. So the access to long-term sustainable finance became the attractive proposition for corporates to start focusing on corporate governance practices. So it has got the attention it deserves in the corporate sector, but I think so much more can be done successively apart from corporate governance codes and guidelines that we have issued, and more recently the guidelines focusing on diversity and inclusion as well. We have also issued in 2013 the corporate social responsibility guidelines, and more recently, within the last month, the ESG roadmap, by which we want to try and work with the corporate sector to ensure that the kind of measurements and metrics that I was talking about earlier on are in place with time, and we have a standardized measure by which we can determine whether the corporates are actually following it in letter and spirit, as Seema mentioned.
You mentioned metrics for for the second time. I mean, so I think calculation is important.
Absolutely.
So I mean, if I ask you that, how far do you think we can go in policies to sort of have an effective ESG on the ground?
So in terms of metrics, as you know, after COP26, the IFRS has set up the International Sustainability Standards Board. And their job is to really come up with standardized benchmarks for basically the basic guidelines which can be built upon by various jurisdictions. Two standards have been revealed on this standard one, which is on basic financial reporting, sustainability related financial reporting. And the second one is dealing more with climate change and carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. And those are very technical calculations. So first there has to be consensus about which direction we want to take. But once these standards are set and accepted and adopted by various jurisdictions, it will require a lot of detailed calculations to be able to come up to those levels for reporting which will be acceptable across different jurisdictions. So yes, it is important. We are at the very start of that journey as far as ESG reporting and measurement is concerned, but it is a promising start. And as for ESG, the roadmap that we revealed, we're hoping that by next year, at least we'll be in a position to start issuing some guidelines on the basis of which the corporate sector will start looking at the various metrics that we need to put in place.
I was going to ask you about guidelines and sort of some kind of a help that the SEC can give out to the corporate sector, but I think you've already helped us on that front, that you're working on that, and SEC will be doing something very soon. But thank you. I would now like to go to Nestle. And Zishan, can you sort of tell me about where does the private sector stand in this whole process, and what can be done to sort of implement these things, and which can sort of go a long way to help our achievement of our goals?
Sure, yeah, no, thank you. And it's so great to be in such illustrious company. I want to thank you all for also being here. As far as the private sector goes, I think there's sort of a lopsided presence, I'd say, in terms of the multinationals being way ahead of the game, with the sort of local companies, smaller businesses sort of struggling to keep up, because obviously with the sort of economic pressures that we have, the financial pressures that we have these days, it's becoming more and more difficult just to do business, just to exist as a financial entity. And so we were sort of lucky because Nestle as an entity started off 15, 20 years ago. We sort of did away with the traditional model of CSR and imbibed what we call creating shared value. And so many, many years ago, we realized that it's not fair or it's not good to be doing this where we're the only ones benefiting or making money. We need to make sure that people in the ecosystem are also benefiting from it. So tier 1 suppliers, tier 2 suppliers, our vendors, our small businesses that are working with us. So I think we sort of had that head start. And so moving from CSV to sustainability to ESG, that evolutionary journey, that you were referring to, is sort of something that's pretty much in our DNA at this point. And so we're I think at the next stage where we're now focusing on data capture and what sort of data to capture and how to use this to our advantage so that we can inspire and motivate others in our own ecosystem, and hopefully even beyond the borders. And we have certifications like the Alliance for Water Stewardship standard certification is in all 4 factories in Pakistan. We're the first Nestle market actually to do that in the entire Nestle universe. Yeah. And that happened like years ago. And again, we had that head start where we had the relationships around the factory, outside the factory 4 walls. We were doing work internally to reduce per ton water consumption to make products as well. And so I feel like, just as obvious, I was saying, this is a journey, right? And so you evolve with the process. But I think the corporate sector in Pakistan, surprisingly, is quite mature when it comes to those things. Unilever, Coke, you're also doing quite well.
If we take Nestle, for instance, and I mean, here I'm going to be unfair. I mean, you have a 150-year head start. Am I correct?
Yeah.
You have a 150 country presence. Right? So that's actually, I think it's a very, I like to think it's a very rich repository of information, which brings me to my next question. I mean, I think we know the answer, but I'd like to hear from you. And of course, you must be using your international experience to sort of let's say, work in Pakistan about things. Is that how it happens?
I think it's definitely quite convenient that we have access to that global, knowledge base, the expertise, and not just at headquarters. We're a Swiss company, but even beyond within the Nestle universe, it's surprising how far mature there were Latin American countries that were pretty far ahead in the game. Some African countries as well. I don't think we give credit to Global South as much as we should. And so you're very right. I mean, we have a head start for those reasons, but we're also sort of wanting to contribute to the broader ecosystem for the same reason that we have that knowledge base and that expertise to build on.
Here's a comment from me, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not asking you a question, I'm asking you to correct me if I'm wrong. Have any actions like ESG been helpful for Nestle as well as for the community?
I think what we're doing right now, in fact, we just finalized our sustainability roadmap last year. And as a result of that deeply introspective process, we realized that the supply chain needs a lot of work. And that's where our sort of greatest opportunity can come from, because we've got tens of thousands of farmers that we work with. And so as a result of that deeper dive into our supply chain, we realized this is the place where we can have the most impact. And so, and there's plenty of work to do all around. I mean, within the factories, outside, head office space. But it's good that we're recognizing where the opportunity lies and where the challenges are, so that we can.
I'm also getting from you a sense that once you step into this field, you sort of realize that there's a lot more. Thank you. Mr. Raphael, it's a pleasure to have this discussion with you, and you have an extensive background in environment, amongst other things. So if I can just ask you, what are the major legal implications, and please be micro as well as macro, of having an ESG practice?
Well, let me try and fit where ESG comes into where my major concern right now is, which is the climate crisis. People I speak to again and again don't seem to realize how bad things are right now. We're at 420 parts per million of carbon concentration in the atmosphere, a quantity and concentration not experienced on Earth for up to 20 million years. That's beyond human civilization's experience. And at that time, we were in a 5th extinction event. The United Nations has already declared the Earth is now in a 6th extinction event, because those levels of carbon have now been attained in the atmosphere. There's enough carbon in the atmosphere to secure a 1.5 degree temperature increase compared to pre-industrial levels by the end of this decade. We are at 1.1, 1.2 degrees centigrade warmer than pre-industrial levels here in 2022, and the Earth has experienced perhaps its hottest summer, ravaging crops around the world, fueled with the conflict in the Ukraine, is going to create food crises going forward. And this is only the coolest summer of the rest of your lives. It's going to get worse after this. The United Nations Secretary General has said that nothing short of unprecedented changes in our economic and social affairs are necessary to arrest the climate crisis, which is driven by, let me explain, capitalism, colonialism, consumerism, patriarchy, and the fossil fuel economy. Now, capitalism, neoliberalism, whatever economic system, whatever name you want to give to the present economic system in Pakistan and the world today, allows for the unaccountable exploitation of natural resources and human capital, unaccountable for the creation of wealth in the hands of the very few and the creation of poverty for the many. This system drives the climate crisis. And this is where laws relating to environment and occupational health and safety, such as labor, have been resisting this urge of the industrialist and capitalist to get away with it and make money. The fact that we have 9-to-5 jobs, the fact that we have social security, the fact that we have environment quality standards have all been valiant attempts by civil society to arrest this unaccountable exploitation at the hands of an economic system. And it's ESG laws that hope, it's just one small step, that are a hope to equalize the relationship man has with the planet.
So, I mean, if I can ask you, ESG laws, as you're saying, they can help equate, bring this equilibrium, so to speak. So, I mean, firstly, what kind of laws do you think we need right now, and what is the kind of process that is needed to be put in place to push through those laws?
There are several generations of laws and implementation of laws. The first generation, I'm an environment lawyer, so the first generation of environment laws were fairly straightforward. Factories Act 1932, if you pollute, you will be shut down. Even now, if you pollute, your factory is sealed. But this is counterproductive for economic growth and development. So a second generation of environmental laws were invented, which is what's in vogue in Pakistan today, called the polluter pays principle, which allows for forms of penalty and taxation to hopefully change human behavior. There is yet a third generation of environment law, pioneered no less by the Chinese, who in the 1980s realized that for them to produce 1 unit of GDP was 10 times more wasteful than OECD countries. And so they introduced a Circular Economy Act and the practice of reducing, recycling, and reusing natural resources to make the economy more efficient. It's when you realize that economic development and environmental sustainability are the same thing rather than polar opposites that you reach the third stage of environment law.
Third stage of environment law. So, if we were able to do these things, and I think we're starting the process, I mean, what would be the implication for the country, I mean, in the very short term, medium term, and long term?
Cleaner water, cleaner air, better labor practices.
And how would we enforce all of this?
देखिए, जब भी हुकूमत आती है, what's the first thing they do to become popular? Labor की inspections बंद कर देते. We have a whole raft of labor laws that require you to have bathrooms and minimum standards for your employees. We actually shut that off because of political expedience. The answer is right in front of us. It's not very complicated. Just enforce the laws that we have.
We enforce the laws that we have. So with this, we come to the end of the first round. Will Abid Saab be sharing his thoughts as well? Do we move on to the second round? So now I'll try to sort of summarize where we stand right now. We have two of the, I would call them the largest regulators of our economy on today's panel, and both of them have said, highlighted, illustrated how important this is for the economy and how they're looking into these factors. Of course, we're going to be now talking about implementation. We have spoken to a leading multinational company, and they serve as an example, and perhaps we can learn from them, and perhaps I think they're keen to learn a little bit more from the environment, which they constantly do, especially from all of their nodes and outlets. And finally, we have the legal perspective, where we might have to change some laws. We might have to bring in more laws, but I believe, if I understood you correctly, that implementation is going to be a critical point. Can I say that?
Yes, obviously, but not that difficult.
Not that difficult. Okay. So with this, we come to the second round of our discussion. And now this discussion is going to be a little more, I dare say, corporate. So I just want to sound everyone off before we start. So I would like to ask Ms. Seema Kamil from the State Bank of Pakistan to share her thoughts. The question is, when we talk about things like green financing, sorry, when I went through that document, it was quite interesting for me at least. But I have a question, and I'm sure many people are going to ask this question. Can you sort of highlight how profitable that business is going to be, and isn't it going to be a little more expensive financing?
No, actually, there are two aspects to this, right? So we've also done, further to our green banking guidelines, and I spoke about letter and spirit, we've also done a sustainable banking project along with the IFC, where we've now laid down the sort of a manual and how exactly, and we built social risk into it. Also stuff like child labor, women's, harassment of women, illegal land acquisition, and all of that into it. And unless a bank can demonstrate to us as regulator that they have taken it seriously, we start to tackle the implementation issue. Now, many financial institutions have also realized, for example, if a major bank in Pakistan, and now we're talking local institutions, not multinationals, and I think there is some hope there. If they want foreign funding, now the large hedge funds or investors of the likes of BlackRock will not invest unless you can meet a certain ESG level, right? They are very, very strict because they work with pension funds, and the amount of noise that younger people are making about this in the West is making sure that they will have access to these funds. So I know that.
Sorry to jump in. So can I ask you that, would that create a crowding in effect? Would it sort of create a sort of an environment where people who have sort of ESG stuff done, they can have a ticket to get into that crowd?
That's right. That's right. And then that affects bottom line. Now, if you can do green bonds, for example, and you've done one and the market is huge, you will get much better rates. Right. So then I know that Rafi Saab spoke about capitalism and the profit motive and so on. And I subscribe on a personal level to a lot of what he said. However, unless we can bring corporate world, and this is multinationals and locals, unless there is a bottom line impact of doing this and they see positive bottom line, the letter and spirit will remain. So I think what we're seeing through green bonds and these things, that they will actually have a positive bottom line effect. There are banks in Pakistan, not multinationals, local banks, who have now said will not touch coal, for example, right? Okay. So then that makes it viable. I agree that we are a bit late in the game. And what we need most of all, and which we will have to develop, is a green taxonomy. We don't have a green taxonomy at all. So we won't know what is truly green in the projects. And then you end up with what's called greenwashing.
Sure.
So yes, we have to have these guidelines.
Better late than true. Thank you. Ms. Sadia Khan, I'm going to be asking you about metrics. Okay. There are, according to my information, more than 130,000 registered companies with SECP. And when I started my career, registering a company was quite a huge project. But now it's been simplified to a process where it's completely legal, completely solid, and of course, it's very fast. So you mentioned metrics twice, so that brings us to think that, okay, how can we plausibly measure these things? Because to be honest, I mean, if I were given the task, I would really have to think, how am I going to bring in the ESG impact assessment? So if you could just sort of shed light on that.
Thank you, Prem. Before I get to the metrics, let me just briefly describe the process we employ whenever we introduce a new concept. The first stage is sensitization. We have to get the ownership within the corporate sector and the understanding that this is for the benefit of the corporate sector. Next comes the guidelines to basically show the way. And at the very last stage are the rules and regulations, where strict implementation is required if there's no traction in that direction. So we really have the initial phase of sensitization to do right now, so that the sense of ownership does come from the corporate sector, and the business case is elucidated for them to be able to do it on their own. So before I go to the metrics of ESG, which are some of the dozen ESG framework that are out there, and no consistency for which the international investor can really compare apples to apples when looking at different opportunities. I just want to mention two aspects of other guidelines that we issue, and this is to both look at the demand and the supply. Now, for in terms of supply, Seema has already mentioned the green bonds, the Sukuk guidelines, even gender bond guidelines. But whenever I talk to market participants about why they haven't had greater uptake, they say there's lack of appetite, and also process-wise, it should be much simpler than the others. Now, process-wise, at this stage, it can't be simpler, because if you are going to stamp something as ESG friendly or gender friendly, obviously you have to have some basis for doing it, rather than what the term right now is greenwashing. There's a lot of greenwashing taking place because people just say this is environmentally friendly, but in the absence of proper measurement or a third-party authentication, it's really, I mean, it's anybody's guess. So on the demand side, we've issued stewardship guidelines, which are guidelines for institutional investors to try and instigate that demand on behalf of, as stewards of the investment money, to ask the investing companies to try and focus more and more on these issues. So we're hoping that both on the supply side and the demand side, there will be that wherewithal that will create that traction towards greater ESG policies.
So sorry to jump in. I mean, if I understand you correctly, that if you sort of create this interest, if you use the word traction, so I mean, if you get the traction you have, and if we sort of go back to what Ms. Seema Kamil said about, I would call it the crowding in effect, sort of creating a crowd where you can't get any investments unless you sort of have that ESG ticket with you. So are we to understand that we're close to being able to sort of have some guidelines regarding calculations, impact assessment?
So the impact assessment will really come when we have some standard format across different jurisdictions, because money doesn't have boundaries, right? The investors want to pursue the best investment deals across jurisdictions, and if they are not able to compare the investment opportunities and ESG component of that across borders, they will not be able to sell. So if some jurisdictions have better standards and others don't, obviously the funds will go in that direction. So our effort is really to try and get some consistent frameworks which are internationally acceptable. And that's why I mentioned the ISP standards, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board, which has so far released 2 standards to be debated right now, both within Pakistan and internationally. And when those are accepted, then they will become part of those metrics that the corporates will then have to implement to ensure that they're able to compare across jurisdictions. So unfortunately, we're at a very early stage as far as that is concerned. But we're hoping that, as said, by next year, after these 2 standards have gone through the deliberations and the advocacy phases that they all have to go through, then the respective jurisdictions, including Pakistan, will adopt these. And that will provide that level of comfort to international investors that we are also able to provide the same level of measurements and impact analysis as other jurisdictions. And that, I think, will really facilitate investments into non-corporate sectors.
That's absolutely, I think, clear. And I believe that there's going to be a size factor as well, impact geographical, let's just say, proximity factor, which would
Structure, and you require that kind of expertise and human resources and technology to be able to come up with those measurements as they required.
True. So we're building the structure as we move along. So I would like to ask Zishan, you mentioned sustainability, and can you sort of explain how does Nestle sort of build up sustainability in a concept as well as a project? And I know this might be a very loose question, or not a loose question, but it's like a female question. But the point is that it's very critical to sort of capture that point. How does an organization do something? It's a simple question.
So I think, speaking on behalf of Nestle, it's easier because, like I mentioned earlier, global expertise, and it's sort of been in the DNA for decades already. But I think a lot of this comes down to obviously local level leadership, your own enthusiasm within the teams. This is something that we get inspired by on a day-to-day basis because a lot of people inside the company are very adamant about it. I think there's something to be said about the generational push as well, the consciousness that comes from the youth.
If I can ask you, is it like the younger people are more sensitive, or is it the other way around?
I think it goes both ways. I mean, the mentality and the sort of predisposition is already there. Just depends who you ask, and some people are probably more vocal about it. But as far as our own working into how it sort of fits into a broader framework in terms of the business itself, I think it all boils down to how you take all the teams along with you. So, I mean, when we are sourcing our milk, we lay down very, very specific guidelines to the farmers, for example, right? So, when you go to a small farmer, you'll see that the poor guy is going to be wallowing in like dirt and dust and mud. The water is going to be stale from the day before. There's no spacing between animals, so no opportunity for open grazing, free grazing. So we've been pushing this for years now, and this is all complementary support, right? So nothing comes out of the farmer's pocket, the expertise, or you're helping them. We're helping them, right? Okay. Essentially giving them sort of, and these are global best practices, right? I mean, just give them clean water, allow for free grazing, open grazing. We're in the process of creating a net zero farm as well, sort of to highlight that you can be a carbon neutral business and still be able to give the quality milk that the company has been requesting of you. And so, yeah, I think the sustainability sort of, it's not a mantra. I think it's something that's become sort of second nature, and we don't really question each other on it now. It's sort of like, we have to do it, we're going to do it. And that's how. So
here's my, this is how I sort of see it, and I don't know how our friends who are watching see this, but it's almost like the concept is brought to every level of work and management. It's not just one level concept. It's sort of translated, if I dare use that word, it's translated down to the grassroots. Is that how it happens?
I think it's an accurate assessment.
Okay. Thank you. So, Mr. Rafael, coming to you, I'm going to go back to where we sort of, how do you effectuate laws? I mean, we need to sort of strengthen that aspect. So, I mean, you said it's easy, it's right there. Just if I remember correctly, what you said, the laws are there, the system is there, just implement it. So, how do you do it?
I get a sense that business and industry is given a certain pedestal. And I'm reminded, the first joint stock companies were actually, I think the East India Company was the first, was actually incorporated by,
second.
Was it the South Sea Company?
No, there was another one before.
But it was through active parliament. Yes. This is before you could incorporate through Companies House. And the debate in parliament,
and they needed a charter as well.
They needed a charter. And the debate in parliament to create something that didn't have, as I think, a soul to dam or a body to kick. The rationale was that there would be an end benefit to society. Okay. The very concept of this veil of incorporation was that companies would be an end benefit to society. The sugar industry here is pound for pound the largest water polluter in Pakistan, unko financing. The cement industry is pound for pound the largest greenhouse gas emitter in Pakistan because most of us cement fire, unko financing. The petrol we import into Pakistan and diesel is some of the dirtiest and filthiest available in the world and is killing us in our cities. We are losing life expectancy. Unke liye banks LCs khol. It's very straightforward. You know who the bad guys are. Why are you putting industry on a pedestal when they are harming people? I met a banker a year and a half ago who very proudly told me he'd been part of the financing team, I forget which bank it was, that helped Engro secure the Sindh Engro mining company and the power plants. Very good for him. There's a report out by
Sorry, just to be clear, this is the coal mining.
That's correct. And the power plant that's associated with it. There's a Center for Research in Air and Environment that published a report in May 2019 based just on the amount of coal that's going to be consumed based on what we know of nitrogen dioxide and sulfur emissions that come from that much coal, and based on what we know of the population of the area, some 30,000 people are going to lose their lives prematurely. We live in a world where we give medals to one bunch of people and ignore the other. And you're asking me that this is a tough proposition. This, in my mind, is as clear as day. You don't let the corporates get away with unaccountable exploitation of natural resources and human labor, and you make sure the laws are not there to attract them. Those laws have to be there to stop them, because things are far worse than you know they are. This is not the planet you live on anymore. This is the coolest summer of the rest of your lives. And these laws can't be palliative. They have to be harsh and stringent.
Okay, so thank you. We are very clear about that. Implementing the law without giving quarter to any organization and any person or organization that has violated the law. So with this, we come to the end of round 2, and I'll try to sort of summarize round 2. And it's ESG is going to be eventually profitable for organizations, because larger groups have become part of the ESG family, ESG environment. Having said that, SECP, I understand, is in the process of creating a system which will very soon become more lucid for us to understand and follow. And of course, sustainability requires that every tier of management as well as execution needs to know what you're talking about. That's how you can implement a concept like ESG. And finally, we need to implement the law without any favor or prejudice to anyone. So with this, we come to the end of our round 2. And I think we can have a question and answer session.
Yeah.
I think let's take questions.
Yes.
Yes, sir, please.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you very much for a very engaging panel discussion, very insightful. This is Asad Amin Khan from ACC in Pakistan. So a lot has been talked about in terms of bringing ESG or looking at it from a sustainability lens. So my question is that taking example of Nestle, so how we can create this awareness that sustainability or ESG in itself is actually a profit center and is not a cost center, and how it can enhance the competitive advantage for businesses. And based on the experience that Nestle brings on to this panel discussion, if you could probably share the top 3 pillars in terms of simplifying this journey, because I think when we talk about ESG, the connotation is that it is very cumbersome, it is intense, it requires a lot of compliance, it requires a lot of resource allocation. So probably how we can simplify based on your journey, the ESG adoption, so that would be a wonderful insight for all the listeners. Thank you.
So that's a loaded question. I'll start with the second one first, because I think that's actually easier. In terms of ESG adoption within the company, I think if you can subscribe to global norms that apply to your industry, take them as the guiding light. That's something that Nestle did. So like our water business is quite prominent and large in Pakistan. So we went to the Alliance for Water Stewardship and we looked at their certification. It's a huge booklet and we were very daunted by how this was going to be implemented in Pakistan. But surprisingly, I think it's a lot of it is dependent on how you read into it and what you gather from it. You know, it's I'm sure a lot of those things are already being done by a lot of companies. You know, there's already a very strong tradition of charity and philanthropy in Pakistan. Sometimes it just needs to be brought in to include more stakeholders. Sometimes even small things like stakeholder engagement, even holding meetings within your 4 boundaries is also a tick in the box. A very small one, but it's one that you can look into as well. So I think just look at one global standard that appeals to you and your industry and ascribe to whatever is sort of mentioned into it. I know that there are companies like Nestle that do this, so I would recommend that We have an open door policy, and so we always like engaging with stakeholders who are in our network. We have something called Seeing is Believing, and so anyone who would like to visit our factories, see our farms, speak to our farmers, we have an open door policy. Feel free to reach out to me or just leave a query on the social media or our website. We'd be happy to open the doors and show you what it's all about, because there's nothing to hide.
So I have to jump in here. There are some Pakistani examples as well. I'm not going to take any names on purpose, but they started doing these things a long time, and I'm not going to get into who and when, but it was a very simple concept that be symbiotic, don't be parasitic. It's as simple as that. I mean, that's my interpretation of when I saw it with my eyes. But I would like to ask this a similar question. I would like the State Bank of Pakistan and the SCCP to just sort of give us a feel for how are you sort of how do you implement this new concept like this? It's a very simple question.
Should I? Will you ask Sadia?
Please करें.
Okay, so we have what we have developed under our sustainable banking project. We have actually, there is no need particularly to start from ground zero, right? We need to, there's a lot of work already done in many jurisdictions, and we've benefited from that using the World Bank and IFC. And we've actually made templates and tools for the banks to use, right? So they can look at a project and they can then fill out that template, and then that will be used by us as regulators to see how well they are going on ESG parameters. So this will not just be the banks, but then also the corporates that borrow. Now we spoke about, for example, sugar, we spoke about power, we spoke about cement. So those are entities that need, for example, to go into clean energy. So linked to that, then we have our renewable energy scheme, right? Which actually, while many may not know about it, but it's actually, we give the finance to banks. They on lend at a very attractive rate. And so far, we have actually disbursed 83 billion rupees in that. And also 1,700 projects, big and small, with 1,500 megawatts of energy, clean, which is mostly wind and solar, right? And it's also available to vendors. So it's, actually doing practical things like that, which will then enable, for example, a cement producer or a textile company, because if they go to their bank, they can get one, renewable energy finance, and secondly, they will have to be ranked on their ESG. Textile, they can't export to some of the big houses unless they can show, and they have webcam cameras with there, that there's no children working there, for example, and that sort of thing, or the air quality and so forth. So, one can be cynical and say it's a small start, but there are actually local companies who are starting to do this in a significant way.
Very true. Ms. Sadia Khan, can we ask the same question regarding HCCP? How do you sort of implement a new concept that you might hear?
Sure. So the thing I'm going to answer this slightly differently in terms of the sensitization that we need to do in the corporate sector. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it helps to help them understand the business case. But at the end of the day, a lot of them are focused on the bottom line and profits. So we always talk to them in terms of what their interests are. And for me, it's a pet approach, it's profits, employees, customers. So when you have sustainability reporting and you have access to sustainable capital, your cost of capital is lower, that impacts the bottom line, profits are better. In terms of employees, you get the best employees attracted to your institution, because as we're talking, the millennials, they're all about the purpose of life. Nobody's really talking about that they want to become this or that. They really want to make a difference and have an impact. And because of social media, there's so much greater awareness about what they want to do in life. And it all revolves around really that having an impact through ESG. And third is customers. If the environment around you suffers, if the community around you suffers, First of all, there's going to suffer. If there's no planet to cater to, you're not going to be producing anything. So I mean, it's really basic. You said to simplify the message, and that's as simple as we can make it. And the fourth aspect really is leading by example. So when we talk about implementing ESG policies, we start inward. I mean, through all the processes that you mentioned earlier, but in terms of registration, reducing the paperwork, even calculating the number of trees we've saved in the year by really cutting down the paperwork internally. We've also enhanced gender diversity and inclusion within our own ranks. If and when the SCPs weren't built in, we've decided to have been built in. So these are things that we do internally to show the message that we're leading with example, we mean what we say. And I think that itself should have a positive message in the corporate sector that we're there, we mean business when we talk about this.
And there's going to be guidance as well, if I can understand correctly, because it's going to be something new for many organizations to sort of become part of it. Many want to be part of it as a citizen of the country, a corporate citizen. And definitely, it's going to be a process, but as long as there's guidance, I think it will be much easier.
So the ESG roadmap that we just released, the phase 1 is awareness. We have a number of months for that. Then there'll be dashboards and indices, and as I said, finally, those guidelines that will come out to guide the public about which direction.
Just to share a quick comment, then we'll take the next question. Yes, please. I was interacting with a government organization. I won't take the name, although I should. They told me that in a span of 1 year, they had brought down their entire paper from 1.5 million sheets of paper a year to, take a guess, 0. It was in 1 year. So when there's a will, there's a way. Yes, we have another question.
Thank you very much. I'm Shafkat Munir from SDPI. I would like to thank Nestle for joining us for this discussion and all the panelists here and online. I think the discussion is really good on ESG. When we look at the sector here in Pakistan, when Sadia was talking about the CSR thing, I have observed that the international companies, they are meeting the standards of CSR. But the local companies, even bigger, I have worked with them and interviewed them and analyzed their work, whether they are doing CSR or not. But much of their work is just philanthropic work, either industrial or individual level. But that doesn't count as CSR number 1. Number 2 is the CSR is just guideline, not a mandatory law. There has been a lot of, we have also submitted our submission after my study. But still that is there, but that may take some time. But at least when we talk about ESG, there comes the responsibility towards sustainability. Throughout the discussion, I think we have to frame it around some of the strategic framework, like SDG 8, when we are talking about social, on decent work and related thing. Then there is a SDG 12, when we particularly talk about sustainability practices, sustainable consumption and production. In one of my recent studies, I have seen in Pakistan that in 2017, government has made a national action plan. I have reviewed national action plan against the deliverables. So we are flat on that. Not that much success has been done. That is also a responsibility of the regulators here. The studies there, I have just submitted it with the UN. And then there is SDG 13 that also talk about environment, climate change. Where does these practices, which under ESG we do, stand with these frameworks available at the international level? And that is also commitment of Pakistan. Thank you very much.
So let me address both points that you raised. First on the CSR guidelines, you're absolutely right. They were left as guidelines. And I think for a reason at that time, they were published in 2013. What we have in Pakistan is a very hybrid model of CSR. You have the American model, where largely you set aside 1 or 2% of your profits for these activities. And that's a very structured approach, and some corporations follow that. Then you have the European model, where it's more in terms of the activities you undertake, which impact your bottom line. As an example, if somebody goes around the villages teaching the kids how to wash hands and be hygienic, it's the branding of that particular so, which really impacts their marketing and then hence the bottom line. So in Pakistan, we find that the corporate sector is using one or the other approach, either the European or the American approach. But then there is the cultural aspect where philanthropy comes in. And I think that's very much part of a social religious fabric, that we want to do good, but we don't want to publicize it. A lot of people want to do it because it's mandated in religion, because that's what they want to do. But that's not something they want to make part of the corporate reporting. And hence, what you mentioned is that third aspect. A lot of philanthropy is taking place, a lot of good work is happening, but it's not being recorded because there's a personal decision or a corporate decision for those entities. We left it as guidelines because we do realize that this is something that is up to the corporate sector to decide. But as we go towards ESG reporting, and that S part becomes important as well, I think we will need to look at how do we really capture that S aspect going forward. The second aspect, you mentioned the SDGs. And in fact, whatever we do in terms of guidelines, we are mapping against which particular SDGs they are relevant to. Inclusion and gender diversity, I think SDG 5, health and safety, I think SDG 3, income inequality, I think SDG 10. So every time we talk about a guideline or an initiative that we take, we're very cognizant of the fact with SDG, we're actually mapping it against. And I think there is awareness in the corporate sector also about the various SDGs, and there were, while I was in the corporate sector in Karachi, a lot of UN-related activities where a lot of the large corporates got together and made pledges to follow the SDGs and to deliver some results over time. So I think the cognizance is there. It's just a matter of that mass interest now coming in to ensure that's across the board.
First of all, I would say it's very heartening to see that finally SCCP has, the appointed by Commissioner, they have brought the gender balance is developed. And I'm saying it on purpose. I spent a year and a half with SCCP when Tariq Hassan was the chairman at that time. It's a wonderful organization. And obviously they work very diligently. But do you think that we say go with the buzzword that the market never fails? And we have seen the market fail all the time in Pakistan and this country. So SCCP should be a pivot where all sort of a CSR or not this environment should be pivoted in a way that that is implemented. Because obviously private sector is very important for the growth. But at the same time, the CSR and all these, they are also very important. So we can maintain some sort of a balance there.
As I mentioned earlier, we have taken ESG very seriously, and in fact, since 2002, with the first Code of Corporate Governance and subsequent initiatives, it's really been at the forefront of this drive. And we remain so. Just correcting you on the earlier balance, by pointing me, it's no longer, it's not a balance, I'm 1 out of 5 commissioners. Right now it's a balance because it's just commissioners one. It's 50% right now, just because they haven't appointed 3 other commissioners. But I think, as you mentioned, crises have happened, and we've always learned from it. Internationally, crises take place all the time, and there's always an integrated process to learn from the root causes, to provide solutions, and to go on to the next phase. And we can do just so much in terms of surveillance, in terms of being sure and trying to avert them. But sometimes things do happen, despite all precautions, and our effort is to address those things as soon as possible, but also to learn from those experiences in order to avert those possibilities in the future.
Can I add something here? It's the market. That's it. So here I have to sort of synthesize a question for Mr. Rafael. How do you, if we take these questions and we try to, how do we make this a symbiotic relationship rather than a...
my experience with applying these laws and increasing application of laws has been one of success. The textile industry was hit by demands by their international consumers in the 90s that they wanted non-carcinogenic dyes, so they had to upgrade their dye systems and all the dyes, and the processes because the inks were different and so on and so forth. And they did so, and they did not collapse. Matter of fact, they did quite well. They had further markets that they could access. And then in the 2000,
Sorry to jump in, the business grew.
it grew. In 2000, and because they'd had that experience, in 2010-12, when we had the energy crisis, there's now a center for excellence in energy that out of APTMA. If you're a small or big textile owner, you can go to APTMA, and there's a specialist there who can tell you how to get into the renewable side of your business, get it out, because they have that experience with gas not being available and electricity prices being very high in the 2010-12 period. And then the leather industry that exports out of Pakistan was hit by this leather working group about 2015-16, which is a private, the largest buyers of leather in the world came together and said, we're only going to buy leather from you if you can show us what's happening in your supply chain. And the Saints here, I went and met some in Sheikhupura, were up in arms because those stringent requirements were 10 times higher or more strict than what Pakistani law required them to do. And they were trying to say, but 5 years later, sub-salute. And you see, that struck me. They've all complied. And that's what struck me. Because when you order a belt with a stitching that's an 1/8 of the inch away from the border, as opposed to a 1/2 inch away from the border, that's a specification for which machinery has to be changed and sometimes materials altered. It's not much more of a stretch to think that keeping the factory floor, it's not in environment, social or occupational health and safety, it's another specification. Going down the chain, making sure that the cows that Nestle get their milk from are healthy is not ESG, it is just another specification that the producer must comply with. And if you do so, markets open up.
That's the point that I was actually trying to get from you, being a lawyer, that is it profitable? What was it? And I would take that away from this discussion that we have. If it is done in a logical, helpful manner, this will become a profitable symbiotic relationship rather than something else. So I think with this, we have more questions. Yes, please, the gentleman. Oh,
I had 2 questions. One is that it's very interesting, to always be coming back to the bottom line. The bottom line for Pakistani business people does not appear to include the safety, the health, and the well-being of their labor. I'm sorry to say. And then, there's other issues that Pakistani labor, they seem to think that wearing hard hats is, goes against their masculinity or something funny like that. So there are some other, the government really needs to step in and really take care of the health of the labor. Our labor productivity is among the lowest in the world. And, this is a direct corollary to that. That's one thing. The other thing, the whole discussion has been very helpful, but there's this issue that I wanted to point out. The other issue is that the issue of the cement factory, sugar, and one other, I think I've forgotten which one it is, but sugar takes 13 times the amount of water that, many other competing crops take. I'm an agricultural economist. My name is Dr. Memuna Raouf. So this is the issue that, sugar is very water intensive. Cement is drying out the Potuhat Plateau, the cement factories. And there's the case of Rohtas, Katas temples, and their water is totally dried up and so on. So it's not just a question of renewable energy or so forth. It's actually a question of moving out of that crop or having it in just in the delta area. You should only have it in the delta area where there's excess water. That's where the sugar should be. And there's 79 or plus or 70 to 80 sugar factories. And they're all over the place, in the driest of areas, so that the water is being drawn out from the dry areas. It's a political drop. Every single politician in Pakistan has now some sugar factory. I think it's a matter of status and so on. So there's at certain levels the environment we need to get down to the root cause, and certain terrible decisions were made some year and then several decades ago, in the recent past or the far past. And, getting those people out of those crops, I'm sorry to say, will be a killer. It's not even doable. But so anyway, those were the two things I thought that had not been kind of addressed. Thank you.
Yes, we have a response.
So on the first issue on the health standards within the factories, we do have within corporate governance the onus on the board of directors to track that. And from experience, whenever I've served on a board while I'm in the private sector, the very first metric we used to measure vis-a-vis the factory settings were the health and safety standards for the employees. So it's not across the board, I understand. There are, but the requirement is there in the Code of Corporate Governance to measure that, and the onus is on the board to be able to have some oversight over that. And as said over time, hopefully that can be tracked better over time. It's a matter of this other smaller entities now also implementing it. On the second thing, the crop rotation, I'm not an expert, but recently I did attend a conference on reimagining agriculture, and that was very much the topic on why don't we get out of these crops and into other ones. And I think that will require concerted effort. It's not just about more water being taken by certain crops, it's also sugar leads to obesity and the other health hazards related to that as well. So it's a matter of that national consciousness, but also a direction perhaps from policymakers about what would be the optimal usage of land, given that land is also limited. So I think these are conversations that do need to take place, but it also requires a concerted discussion between various stakeholders so that they can be part of the discourse.
I just want to speak to the notion that people don't have a sense of their own safety or health or well-being, to that notion that some people may not have. In my experience, there's not a single father, mother, or sibling that doesn't care immensely about the health and well-being of their family and loved ones. Sometimes when we think of these things, we think of the global north and how organized they are and how they care for these things. But I'll remind you that when coal was discovered as a means of producing energy, diverted from water to coal, creating, it allowed energy to be produced where people were for the first time. So that's when industry moved to cities. That's when the Industrial Revolution and climate change began. And that's when labor malpractices started, when the workhouses existed, when there was child labor. Even the English people at the time had no sense of their health, well-being, and safety. We do have this